There are three preliminary steps before you get into forgiving yourself. One is take it to God. The second is repair the social damage that
Mm,
was done. And the
mhm.
third is deal with the psychological damage that
Mm,
was done. You don't have to be flawless in those three,
right.
but you should address those three rather than just say, oh, I forgive myself.
Welcome to the Cross Cultural Site podcast with Professor Paul Youngbin Kim. This podcast features conversations on the intersection of psychology, culture, and faith with renowned scholars in psychology and related fields. And now, here's Dr. Paul Youngbin Kim.
Everett Worthington Jr., PhD, is Commonwealth Professor Emeritus working from the Department of Psychology at Virginia Commonwealth University. He also holds a faculty affiliate appointment at the Institute for Quantitative Social Sciences, Faculty of Arts and Sciences, Harvard University Human Flourishing Program. He continues to be active in research and speaking around the world. He is a licensed clinical psychologist in Virginia. He has published over 45 books and around 500 articles and scholarly chapters, mostly on forgiveness, humility, and positive psychology, marriage, and religion and spirituality. He has developed the REACH, REACH forgiveness model with free resources, supported over 30 published randomized controlled trials. REACH forgiveness DIY workbooks are available free in English, Spanish, Chinese, Ukrainian, and Indonesian at the website reach.discoverforgiveness.org. He has developed numerous other positive psychological interventions. He ballroom dances and competes in pickleball. He and Kirby have been married since 1970. Everett, I'm so appreciative of you being willing to talk to me on the podcast.
It's my pleasure, Paul.
You've been busy in retirement, and that's, I feel like, an understatement. And I guess I'll jump straight into your well-published model of the REACH model of forgiveness. Could you provide a brief overview for my listeners about what this REACH model of forgiveness is?
Right. Well, reach forgiveness is a model where the core of it is about emotional forgiveness.
Mm,
I think there are two types of forgiveness. One's to make a decision about how you're going to treat the other person, and the other is to experience a sense of emotional peace as a result of forgiving. And so the core of that is really marked by five steps.
mm,
And the letters are an acronym that cue people's memory for that. So R, recall the hurt, but not in a way that continues to just rehearse what a victim I've been or what a jerk the guy is that hurt me. E, which is to emotionally forgive the person. A, give an altruistic gift of forgiveness. C, commit to the forgiveness you experience. And H, hold on to that forgiveness when you doubt. So what that model does is that's in the middle, but we actually start by, defining the two types of forgiveness and then telling people about the benefits to the forgiver of forgiving,
mm,
such as physical health benefits, mental health benefits, relational benefits, spiritual benefits. And then after we have gotten to that place, then we're ready to help people walk through the emotional forgiveness,
mm,
the REACH. And then after they've experienced some of that, then we invite them to make a decision to treat the person differently based on their experience emotionally forgiving.
mm,
And the last part of that model is about kind of generalizing this to other hurts that people have had. So this is a kind of a 12-step model, but having nothing to do with the 12-step model. But
mm.
they go through 12 steps to try to spread out their application of this into their life more widely so that they become a more forgiving Christian or a more forgiving person.
Mm. Thank you for that overview. And am I hearing correctly? Then the reach model part of this is focused on the intrapersonal aspect of the person, the emotional, the thought processes that the person might be experiencing. Is that right?
Right.
Yeah.
we point that forgiveness is something that is experienced inside our skin.
Mm,
It is it's an emotional change. It's a decision about our behavioral intentions.
mhm.
It happens in an interpersonal context.
Mm,
So obviously, someone has hurt me or offended me. If I
right.
feel unforgiveness, and therefore, there are interpersonal consequences.
Mhm,
And so reconciliation is a choice that people can make to try to reconcile, but it is an interpersonal experience. And therefore, it actually involves two people.
mm,
So I can say that I want to reconcile, but if the other person does not want to be trustworthy, if they want to kill me
mm,
or hurt me every time they see me,
mhm,
we're not going to reconcile. So
mm.
we can invite people to try to reconcile if they wish,
Yeah.
but also caution them that, reconciliation requires two people and the decision requires a trustworthiness on both people's part that they're
Mhm.
trying to reconcile.
Yeah, I appreciate that distinction because you're saying forgiveness doesn't have to include a reconciliation. It's a good thing to have, but like you said, if the perpetrator is unwilling to reconcile, then still forgiveness is possible according to the Reach model.
Right. So
Hmm.
forgiveness is possible for anyone under any circumstances, although it can be very difficult, of course.
Mm,
So we believe that the process of forgiving is going to start with a harm or an offense
mhm,
to the person.
mm,
And then that creates what we call an injustice gap,
mm,
which is a sense of how much injustice I've experienced as I kind of relate. This is the way I would like this to be resolved. This is the way that I see it right now.
mm,
That's a big injustice gap.
mhm,
And we tell people there are many ways to close that injustice gap,
mm,
many ways that are actually consistent with Christian scriptures.
mm,
So turning the matter over to God
mm,
for divine justice or for just relinquishing it to God, seeing justice done, forbearing, deciding I'm just going to tolerate this actually, or accepting and moving on. Lots of good ways that are consistent with scripture
mm,
to deal with that injustice gap. Forgiving is one of those ways. And
mhm,
so we actually, even as Christians, don't have to forgive
mm,
because we may not experience that root of bitterness that is so devastating that when we get to that part, I think we need to forgive. But
mm,
with just minor injustices that we experience, we can deal with that by just, oh, I'm going to turn this over to God, or I'm
mm,
going to just forbear. Paul says in the scriptures, forgiving them and forbearing.
mm.
So he makes a distinction between forbearance or just putting up with it for the good of the community, for the good of the group, for the good of the relationship.
Mm, mm. Wow, that's really powerful. Thank you for sharing that. I know that there's research out there on forgiveness in connection to interpersonal trauma, especially the type of interpersonal trauma that my listeners are particularly interested in, such as the effects of contemporary forms of racism, like racial microaggressions. Can you share your insights on how something like REACH might be applied in the context of someone who might have experienced racial microaggressions or other forms of microaggressions like gender microaggression?
Yeah, I think that anytime a person offends us or harms us in some way, that is possibility to forgive.
Mm,
And especially if these are repeated microaggressions, even whether the person does them intentionally or whether the person is just unaware of what is happening, those build up.
mhm,
So we experience, let's say we could rate hurts on a $1, $5, $10 type hurts, where $10 is like huge,
mhm,
injury to me. But the $1 hurt that I experienced the first time, if I experience it a second time from the same person, it feels more like a $2 hurt.
Mm,
And if I experience it a third time, it
mm,
starts to feel like a $3 hurt. And so they can build up.
mhm.
So the nice thing is you can keep a short account if you apply that reach forgiveness model and take care of the unforgiveness that I feel as it happens rather than let it build up
Mm.
to where I've had a $1, a $2, and a $3. So I'm now $6 in debt because of my experience. And then it's a lot harder. We've got a big injustice gap instead of a smaller injustice gap.
Yeah, I I like that metaphor because it relates well to my understanding of microaggression, which is that it's not the one experience that hurts, but it's the cumulative experience. We talk a lot in the literature about, like, they use analogies like death by a thousand cuts, or it's not the one time experience, but it's the multiple cuts that endure. And I think what you're speaking to is the importance of forgiveness, maybe at a time when it hasn't built up into this large impact, where maybe doing the forgiving or bring in forgiveness like at the $1 or $2 stage, if you will. Um,
Right. Or even that there are all of these different alternatives for dealing
mm,
with it. So
mhm, mhm,
bringing justice into the situation. So
mm,
if a person has done microaggressions 2 or 3 times, at that point, I may want to say, I need to actually have a conversation in love and gentleness, but to have a conversation to kind of bring some justice into this and not just forgive it so that I get to forgive it again at time 4, time 5, time 6, but let's take a different approach as
mm.
well as forgiving the hurt.
Right, right. Yeah, I like that. And also, when we talk about microaggressions with my students, we also emphasize that sometimes you have to figure out what you want that relationship to be. In other words, sometimes a microaggression from a trusted friend is dealt differently compared to a microaggression from a stranger. And so I also wonder about forgiveness and how that might apply or not apply when it comes to someone who's walking by and says something offensive. And you then maybe choose to forbear, like the language that you use, which is,
Yeah.
I, it's not something that I want to dwell on or think about, but I give it to God for God to deal with. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, it's like if a person bumps me in the street,
Hmm.
then I'm like, "Oh, I forget it by the time I've gotten down to the end of the street."
Right.
If they bum me in the street, but they gave me a little shoulder so that
Mm.
it's personal, and this is
Hmm.
more like a passing microaggression,
Hmm.
right? Which would be more verbal, but the same idea.
Hmm.
I'm not going to forget that by the time I get down the street, but I may choose. I don't need to chase this person down and give them a thrashing. I need to forbear here. This
Right.
is not worth it. I don't really have a relationship with that
Hmm.
person other than a very passing relationship.
Hmm. Yeah. That's well put. While we're on this topic of microaggression, I have one more thing that students often bring up to me that I also want to sort of process with you. And that is, for microaggression, students often ask, but most times or many times, the microaggressor might not be intending to injure the other person, might not be intending to say something hurtful. And my reply is often, well, but the impact on the person might be felt very differently. It might land very differently, where the injury might be similar as someone who intentionally microaggresses. So from that perspective, like, how do you make sense of intent versus impact when it comes to forgiveness? Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I would be inclined to give the person the benefit of the doubt at
Mm,
first. Oh, they just don't understand. And maybe the second time to give them the benefit of the doubt. But
mm,
the third time, if this is a cherished relationship, then I want to continue this relationship. And that means there needs to be some repair of the rupture to the emotional bond between us.
Mhm.
So I need to address it in love and caring and gentleness, but I do need to address it.
Mhm. Mhm.
So
Yeah. So again, evaluating how frequently this is occurring, but also the nature of the relationship you have with that person. Yeah,
yeah,
that's really, really important. I know you've done a lot of research cross-culturally with the REACH model. Again, my listeners are, many of them are graduate students, even junior faculty or early career faculty, and they're thinking about sort of the cross-cultural generalization of some of these ideas. So I'm curious if you could give a brief overview of how the REACH model holds up across cultures. I know you have a lot of data on this, but if
we
you had
do
to
have
give
a
a
lot of
succinct
data.
summary, yeah.
Yeah. So I've just been blessed to have collaborated with a lot of really bright folks around the world. And so that has allowed us to test this in quite a number of locations. So we just did a big study
Mm,
and when I say big, I mean, there were actually more people who went through this intervention than have gone through all other intervention studies in studying forgiveness combined.
wow.
So it's a huge study.
Mhm,
And it was done in China,
mhm,
Indonesia, in the Ukraine, in Colombia, and in South Africa.
mm,
And in all of those locations, it worked and worked quite well.
mm,
But there were differences in the sites,
mm,
and a lot of that has to do with the nature for people doing research in this, so you understand this very easily. There's not just a cultural difference, but there's what was the sample that was used.
mm,
And so, for example, in Colombia, there were two samples. One was a private secular
mm.
university, and the other was war survivors.
Oh, wow.
Well, applying this to survivors of some kind of harm done over 60 years of civil war
Mhm,
is very different than being a 19-year-old college student.
right.
And even though they lived in that culture, but in 2016 there was a peace accord, and so most of their early adult life has been in a climate of relative peace.
Mm,
Again, in South Africa, it was a general
mhm,
survey in the population. Well,
mm,
in that general survey of the population done online rather than more closely monitored, they didn't do as strongly
mm,
as the Colombia folks.
mm,
In Hong Kong,
mm,
it was people in the community, but it was in the midst of the big clashes that they were having with the pro-democracy or
mhm,
kind of strong leadership from
mhm,
People's Republic of China. And so that was a high conflict area. The Ukraine, there were actually two sites in the Ukraine. One of them was right now where the border is with the
mm,
Russia controlled areas of Ukraine versus the Ukrainian control. So it was very close to the front, and the
mm,
other was in Kiev. So it's away
mm.
from the front, but obviously it was the target of
Yeah.
the first attacks. And this took place right before Russia invaded Ukraine.
Right.
So there was already conflict,
Mhm,
but it wasn't war at that point.
right.
So there were differences in the site, but
Mm,
in the sites of these five countries, but it worked in
mhm,
all of them. And we had done other studies in Ghana,
mm,
Ghana is rated by the CIA as the most Christian country in the
mm,
world.
mm,
So the highest proportion of people who say that they're Christian. And so we did, for example, groups
mhm,
in Ghana of church members because 80 something percent of the people belong to a church. So it's basically a population study. And what we found was that it didn't really matter whether Well, we had some groups that were Christian accommodated. So they used Christian language, had Christian examples. And then we had others that were Christian accommodated, but also accommodated to Ghanaian culture.
Mm, mm,
So there were references to things that were not, were secular Ghanaian
mhm,
cultural beliefs. Well, what we found was once we accommodated for the Christian,
mhm.
because that was such a strong part of their culture, it really didn't matter that we accommodated for Ghanaian culture.
Wow. Mm,
Now let's contrast that with a study we did in Indonesia.
mm,
So Indonesia, in contrast to Ghana, of course, is a principally Muslim country.
mhm,
And so we had a group of people who had been in a Christian climate, but their congregational life had been disrupted by a fire like 10 years before that was set as a kind of anti-religious. So so what we found there was we used this a secular model, not a Christian model,
mm.
but we compared the secular model of reach forgiveness versus a secular model that was also incorporating Indonesian culture.
Mm.
The Indonesian culture adaptations were mostly collectivist type references.
Mm.
And so we did find then that it mattered in Indonesia that you shaped this more toward the culture.
Wow.
So you see,
Mhm,
the culture matters,
mhm.
but different parts of culture
Yeah.
are what's important. And
I
it's like in Ghana, it was the Christian culture
Mhm,
that
mhm.
mattered, and the general culture did. But in Indonesia, the general culture mattered.
Yeah. That's so fascinating. And again, speaks to the complexity of culture and how there's not a one size fits all model when it comes to these cross-cultural studies, cross-cultural validation studies. And when we say we adapt something according to a culture, we have to be very precise about how that was done.
Right. And so even in China,
Mm,
the People's Republic of China has such a kind of history of de-emphasizing religion
mm,
that forgiveness is not valued as much as it might be in even in Indonesia,
mm,
because Islam values forgiveness
mm,
just like Christianity values forgiveness. But
mm.
there's a difference in China, and so people still practice forgiveness, but it's not part of the air or part of the water that they're swimming in as much
Mm.
as it is in cultures that are more religiously oriented.
Wow. Fascinating. Going back to that then, were there, I guess, for example, we in cross-cultural psych, we talk about linguistic equivalence as being important, but sort of the lowest bar in cross-cultural generalizability, right? That there's not only do you have to translate the word forgiveness correctly, but also that word has to mean the same thing. That functional or conceptual equivalence is important.
Mhm.
I mean, I know this is sort of a broad question, but like as you were doing these cross-cultural studies, did you ever run into a case where the word forgiveness had different connotations or maybe related ideas kind of landed differently depending on the context? Like, can you think of an example where that came up as a difficulty or a challenge?
Sure, I can come up with a
Mm,
particular one, but
mm,
just in South Africa, for example, South Africa is such a rich multicultural
yeah.
environment where you have traditional African
Mhm,
religions, you have
mhm,
traditional African non-religious, but cultural, you have Indians there.
mm,
You have a lot of people who have been brought in from that Indian subcontinent and nearby
mhm,
area. And then you have Dutch Reformed and you
mm,
have English. And
yeah.
so it's very rich and you can use English,
Mm,
but it doesn't mean the same thing in their
Right.
particular culture. And
Yeah.
they all kind of know what it means, but a traditional African who is coming at this where you say forgiveness and they think
Mm.
Ubuntu,
Mm.
which is I am kind of a very collectivistic, I am because you are.
Mhm.
That has a lot more resonance with reconciliation
Mm.
than it does with forgiveness.
Mm.
So when they hear forgiveness, they may treat it like, "Oh, yeah, but you have to reconcile."
Mm.
And that doesn't and you can as a researcher, you can say, "Here's what forgiveness is. Here's what forgiveness isn't." And people are like, "Blah, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I know what forgiveness is." And they go and fill out the questionnaire regardless, depending
Mm.
on what they feel.
Right.
It means basically the same, but
Mhm.
there are a lot of times when you don't reconcile and you do forgive,
Yeah.
or there are actually times when you forgive and don't reconcile.
Mm.
So, but there's times where those two concepts are separate.
Right.
People do reconcile and never forgive. In
Mhm.
a workplace, the workplaces are notorious for that. They're, okay, I have to work together with this person. We're going to have a workplace relationship, but I hate him, and so they've reconciled, they've reestablished trust in their relationship, at least to the point of view of working together.
Yeah.
But on a personal level, they may still hate each other and be very bitter and unforgiving toward each other.
Wow. As you're describing that, Everett, I'm thinking about so many examples that I see around me of that, where people have sort of externally maybe reconciled, but internally there may be bitterness in their hearts. And then I also wonder about the complexities of how, in certain hierarchical cultures, you're expected to be able to sort of separate, I guess, the internal aspects of how you feel about the other person and then the external things, meaning like that dissonance between how you behave versus how you feel about the other person might be more accepted compared to like in the US where we have a value of being consistent with how we feel and being consistent in our behavior with how we feel. So I wonder if that's also sort of an added complexity when working with this kind of a model in a more hierarchical or interdependent culture.
I think it is just in terms of the way the connotation of the word
Mm.
is slightly different, and
Mhm.
but I think it still is a valid at the level that we have of measurement. We're not measuring the microbiology
Mm.
of forgiveness.
Right.
We're measuring a kind of a general feeling of
Mm.
forgiveness, and if a person brings in some reconciliation ideas because that's the way they're supposed to do it. Still, predictors are pretty common,
Mm.
pretty much the same
Mhm.
across collectivistic and individualistically oriented cultures. It's a pretty valid
Mhm.
generalization that you can make. But if you get down to measuring it super precisely, I'm sure things start to bifurcate at that point.
Right. Right. But it's so impressive, the scale of the studies that you're describing. And I, like you said, just can only imagine the number of amazing researchers involved in being able to navigate all of these nuances. I was also thinking about, again, my own cultural background, which is Korean, and how Koreans are known in some sort of academic disciplines as people of collective trauma. Not that Koreans are the only people with collective trauma, but that their sort of collective angst, whether it's because of the colonial period they experienced under Japan or the division of North and South Korea, these things contribute to this feeling of resentment and deep agony that they still harbor today as a collective. And so I completely understand, Everett, that your model is an interpersonal model, but have there been any efforts that you're aware of trying to apply or extend the reach model to more of this collective feeling of resentment and the need for collective forgiveness?
I think people are starting to move in that direction. In fact, I got a contract with Routledge to write a book on forgiveness and reconciliation.
Oh, wow.
I wrote one in 2006 with Routledge, and they approached me to say, "Oh, well, it's been 20 years. We need to, or it will be by the time it gets
Yeah,
out.
right.
We need to update this." And they said, "And you said it was forgiveness and reconciliation, but you wrote it like forgiveness and reconciliation. And we'd like to have it more like forgiveness and reconciliation, more balanced this
Mm,
time."
mm,
So, what I've been thinking about for that book really is to broaden the theory that we have. So, I developed this stress and coping theory of forgiveness in that 2006 book. And so that takes the stress and coping model
mhm,
that is general out in across disciplines, and I applied it specifically to forgiveness, and so that ends up creating ideas like the injustice gap, which
mm,
wasn't in there before,
mm,
and different looking at the benefits of forgiveness. Anyway, I've thought about extending that theory to a stress and coping theory of reconciliation, that there are stimuli, there are stressors that stress us in terms of our reconciliation. There are ways that we appraise those stressors.
mm,
There are reactions that are internal, that are with people, but they're, yeah, and even physiological, but they're also social reactions.
right.
And that's where a lot of the complexity and reconciliation is going to happen. How the people react socially as groups, as interlocking groups, because I'm a Christian, so I belong to a church. I belong to a denomination. I am also a BCU professor. I have a different circle of friends there. I play pickleball. And I have different friends. And so there's all these interlocking
Mm,
circles that are social circles that each may have a different response. And then that's going to create coping responses socially.
mm,
And those, if you think about Bronfenbrenner's social ecology model,
mm,
that's going to create responses on a lot of different levels, from
mm,
individual to dyad to group to community to state to kind of world peace,
mhm,
if you will. So I'm thinking of building that wider
mm,
model to incorporate the stress and coping model of reconciliation,
mm, mm.
and how reconciliation does and does not fail. So, I'm looking forward to spending a bunch of time thinking about that and writing
Yeah,
about that.
I'm so encouraged to hear about that as well, that you are extending a model that was primarily focused, and rightly so, on sort of an individualistic framework, and now kind of incorporating more of the interdependent aspect of it, right? The different layers, like the Bronfenbrenner and others who have talked about the systems that we're part of. Right? Shifting gears a bit, Everett, to teaching, and I know that you're very passionate about teaching as well. Many of my listeners are interested in connecting their Christian faith to their teaching and practice of psychology. I'm curious about your experience of teaching students about forgiveness. And I don't just mean in the college campus, but also in the community as well. I know you do a lot of good presentations to churches and also to secular audiences as well. And I'm curious about, in particular, is it, I guess, easier to teach about forgiveness to Christian students, or maybe in some ways harder, or both? Like, what are sort of the contrasting things when you teach to a Christian audience, like Christian students versus secular students or non-Christian students?
Yeah, I think I probably have gotten more resistance in Christian audiences than I have in secular audiences.
It's
So,
fascinating. Yeah.
yeah, so I taught in the largest or second largest state university in Virginia. And so we teach these big classes of 300 people, or at one point 426 people. And I've been very open with my Christian
Mm,
beliefs. I just tell them from the day one. Of course, I'm a Christian, but so I'm going to approach things with certain values and certain assumptions. And I think it's important that you know that,
mm,
because if you know that, you can evaluate what I'm saying with knowledge and not think that I'm feeding you some kind of impartial, value-free
mhm,
knowledge,
mm,
which I don't think exists. And once I've said something like that, it's almost like really rare that I ever have anybody
right.
respond negatively.
Mm,
With Christians, we are so alert to what's true,
mm,
especially in the more theologically conservative places where I spend probably 75% of my time
mm,
when I'm talking to Christians. So, so people will object to things that you say that are like, "Hey, yeah, that's not the way I understand it. That's incorrect. That is not biblical. That is,"
mm,
and so you get, I think, a lot more resistance in
mm,
those cases than I get in secular organizations. And so little things like, or big things, if you object to it, it's a big thing. If you don't object to it, it's a little thing. So,
yeah.
but people will ask about self-forgiveness.
Oh, okay.
And so I'm like, self-forgiveness, fine, let me talk about that. And then you'll have somebody go, that's not biblical.
Mm,
It's God's forgiveness and not self-forgiveness. We don't have the right to forgive ourselves. And so you get people taking a position like that. And I try to explain by using David and his
mm,
confrontation with Nathan, and how
mm,
Nathan told him that metaphor of the lamb, and then confronted David afterwards, saying, David, you are the man
mm,
who did these things. And David immediately says, I have sinned before God and humans. And Nathan, prophet of God, says, God has forgiven you.
mm,
And then we turn to Psalm 51. Create in me a clean heart, O God, restore a right spirit within me, cast me not away from thy presence, purge me with hyssop, and it goes on and on. And you see, if you read under Psalm 51, it says, a psalm of David after being confronted by Nathan.
mhm,
And you're thinking, God took care of every bit of David's moral. And when it says God forgave David, he was forgiven morally,
mhm.
but not all the social consequences.
Right.
Because Nathan went on to say there are going to be social consequences from this, and not all the psychological consequences. And so self forgiveness is not something we do at all to replace what God did with divine forgiveness. It's
Right.
something we do to take care of the social and the psychological
Mm,
problems that happen. And so I try to explain that, but you still have people digging their heels in and goes, the words self forgiveness are not in scripture.
mm,
And I'm like, well, self condemnation is in scripture. It doesn't maybe say the word, but you
mm,
just, it's all through the scripture. And how do you deal with that self condemnation psychologically? And
mm,
yeah, morally, uh, God deals with it. But socially and psychologically, we have to deal with it ourselves. So I'm on a little rant. I'm sorry to be
No, this is
a
really
rant like this, but
it's compelling. It's compelling stuff. I'm like
yeah,
taking mental notes on the scripture references because I that statement of that's not biblical is something that comes up often whenever us psychologists talk to our church communities. And I think it does give us sort of a pause, at least gives me a pause in terms of, oh, I need to learn to communicate more effectively with my church community and how maybe the world that I swim in as a psychologist has a different language when it comes to describing these things. And I need to sort of find ways to frame it that makes my church community less defensive, right? But that term biblical comes up a lot when I share stuff with my church communities. Yeah.
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 I think with interventions, so the reach forgiveness model, people can get threatened
Mm,
by that and say, well, that's secular
mm,
psychology.
mm,
What about prayer? What about just confession
mm,
and the things that are in practical theology? And I have to try to make a distinction and say, I am not trying to replace at all anything that we have done in 2,000 years of church life. We have perfected a lot of things, but people just have to ask themselves, oh, so with all these things that we do in the church, do you ever feel unforgiving towards someone?
mm.
Oh, yeah, I guess I do. Every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, you know. Okay, well, so maybe there are other things that maybe
Yeah.
this will become part of practical theology someday. But it's something that can supplement what we do in the church, not replace what we do in the church.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. I like that psychology has something to add, but it's not trying to take away what the church has been doing well.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to go back to that idea of self-forgiveness because closely related idea is passion. And I have tried to introduce that idea to my Christian circles. And even that word self in front of compassion gets critiqued as not biblical, selfish, because you're focused on the self and not being compassionate on other people. And so to try to unpack that idea for me has been challenging. But I just wanted to make that connection that in my circles, the conversation has been about self compassion and how
Mm.
might that look like in a Christian community. And I imagine not the exact same thing as self forgiveness, but maybe a closely related construct.
Somewhat closely, I think they're
Yeah.
correlated. There have been quite a number of studies that have looked at both self-forgiveness and self-compassion, so that
Mm,
they tend to be correlated like point 0.5 or point 0.6
mm, mm,
because self-compassion is more a generosity toward yourself in
right.
general,
Mm,
but self-forgiveness tends to be, I did something wrong and I have guilt and
mhm,
okay, well, I can be generous to myself, but I need to repair the wrong
mhm,
also. And so, with our approach to self forgiveness, we talk about there are three preliminary steps before you get into forgiving yourself. One is take it to God, the second is repair the social damage that
mm,
was done. And the
mhm,
third is deal with the psychological damage that
mm,
was done. You don't have to be flawless in those three,
right.
but you should address those three rather than just say, oh, I forgive myself. Yes, sure, I've killed 10,000 people, but I
Mm,
forgive myself. No,
right.
it's not self forgiveness. That's just letting yourself off the hook.
Yeah.
You got to be responsible with
Mhm.
self forgiveness, and that involves dealing with the moral, the psychological, and the social aspects.
I appreciate that distinction because it's not just being gracious toward yourself, but taking responsibility. So there's a accountability aspect to
That's right.
self forgiveness. Yeah, yeah. And this is more getting at maybe some personal themes. So feel free to like share as little or as much as you feel comfortable, Everett. But and you and I are psychologists, researchers in psychology, and we are readily on board with the idea that forgiveness is good because it's predictive of all these good things, including the reduction of pathology, including the increase in well being. But also, I mean, today you've been really public about your Christian faith, which I really appreciate. But as a Christian scholar, what motivates you to study forgiveness beyond the strong empirical association that we see, which, we again value that, but also what are some of the personal connections you have to this topic?
Yeah. Well, of course, my interest in forgiveness was more applied and just like anyone struggling with not living up to your own standards and certainly not living up to God's standards.
Mm.
And so I had that, but my response was, let me use the means I have in the church. Let me look at scripture meditation or confession or public confession or confession to a person that I've harmed. But as a professional, I gravitated toward couple therapy
Mm.
very soon. After I got out of my internship and started my licensure pursuit, I had some individual cases, but mostly I zeroed in on couple therapy.
Mm.
I had some family therapy cases. They were basically too hard for me. I mean, here's a couple, they're fighting and arguing, and then I'm seeing, and they've got two kids, and one of them is rearranging all the books on my bookshelf, and the other's doing chin ups on the hair on the inside of my legs. But I'm like, okay, forget family
Yeah.
therapy is for someone else with a little more patience than I have. But it's like mama bear, papa bear, baby bear, you know, couple therapy seemed just right for me. And I found out, of course, as I dealt with couples that eventually, if they decided to stick at this and work at it, it was going to come down in some way to forgiveness.
Mm.
And so that started to be very interesting to me clinically.
Mm.
And it turned out that I was teaching this to people that I was supervising and supervising a couple of agencies out in town. And I was able to teach their counselors how to do the little intervention that we had created. And I rode my bike to school back then. So it was
Mm.
like 8 miles each way. And one night, I'm like, oh man, I do not want to carry that 50-pound backpack that is my guilt that I carry home every night and never work on. I'm just going to leave it at school. So I left
Mm.
it at school one night and it snowed that night. And there I was at home with nothing to do on a snow day. And so I thought, well, I'll just write up that little article about clinically how we
Mhm.
did this stuff. And so I wrote it up and I called up Fred de Blasio, that was one guy that I was supervising, and he had
Mm.
used this. And I said, Fred, do you have a case that you can put on this thing? We'll send it in. So anyway, we get it published. What turned out that is what that little article came out just at the time that Mike McCullough became a graduate student to work with me. And
Mm.
Mike zeroed in on that and said, that's what I want to do my research on.
Mm.
And so every week, Mike would go over to the library. This is back when you had to go to the library, actually. So he would go over to the library, come back covered with dust and paper
Mm.
cuts, and where he's found all these obscure articles on forgiveness. And he would tell me about one of these articles, and I would sit very professorial, and I would stroke my beard, and I'm like, I don't understand what he's saying, but yeah, yeah. And then afterwards, I would have to run over to the library and find that article and read it so I could understand and keep up with this bright graduate student.
Mm.
Turns out that right after him, Steve Sandage came, and he wanted to work on forgiveness, but he had a
Wow.
different standpoint. Mike was social personality.
Mm.
Steve was more psychoanalytically inclined, and then
Mm.
Jen Ripley came next, and she was interested in forgiveness in couples. And I'm making like 3 trips to the library every week to keep up with these graduate students. And finally, I just gave up and said, okay, you've beaten me. Learn about forgiveness. And so I began to really pursue this as a passion of mine.
Mm.
Well, that kind of went on for about 6 or 7 years. I wrote a book with Mike and Steve on forgiveness. And as it was about to come out, my mother was murdered. And so that tossed me into a really different arena of, okay, I've applied forgiveness in lots of different ways, but never to something like this. Well, it turns out I was able to forgive the guy who did this very quickly, which is really unusual, even for me. I mean, people go, "Oh, you're a forgiveness researcher. Of course, you forgive instantly." No, I am a human. And what that murder did was it kind of threw me up into the air about a lot of things.
Right.
And I had an invitation to come to South Africa to be a visiting scholar on behalf of the South African government. And this was 1996. And so this is 2 years after the 1994 elections, that really ended apartheid and brought Nelson Mandela into power. And so I talked with, as my responsibility for visiting scholar, I talked with 8 universities, a number of churches, and 3 different meetings of the Christian counselors of South Africa. Well, by the time I was ready to come back, it kind of crystallized that I really want to focus on forgiveness. That yeah, I have this bunch of articles I've done on religion and spirituality. Yeah, I have this bunch on couple counseling.
Right.
But really, if I'm going to make an impact, I want to talk about forgiveness.
Mm.
And as it turned out, God just created all kinds of miracle events, I think, to really solidify that, including being invited to chair a international search for grants, to fund grants on forgiveness through the John Templeton Foundation. And that ended up with us forming a 501(c)(3) corporation to raise additional $6 million to fund research on forgiveness. And so that kind of connected me with basically pretty much all the major forgiveness researchers in the world, and gave me a platform to talk about forgiveness. And really, it's just because I think that was God's plan, and that's the way that it happened. And I never would have set out to think about anything like that. Like, oh yeah, why don't I get somebody to do an RFP, and why don't I create a nonprofit and run around trying to beg people for money? And now that's not what I would do, but that's what God wanted done, and so that's what we did. So yeah, I don't know if that's kind of a blend of personal and
Yeah.
professional, but that's kind of the way it developed for me.
And that's great. You're so open about sharing about your experiences of trauma and how you were able to respond with forgiveness. That's really powerful to me. And then how in God's timing, I mean, it's strange to say God's timing because it was, I'm sure, a very painful experience, but that was then able to overlap with your research interests and how it just shaped your vocation from that point on. I really appreciate that story, that testimony. And I think sometimes when I read articles by these phenomenal scholars like yourself, it's easy to sort of see that name and their content and sort of compartmentalize them as, oh, that's what they do. But then to be able to hear the story behind that, I think is really enriching. And I really appreciate that. And I think my listeners will appreciate that as well. Everett, I have a couple of questions that I ask all guests. I think one of them you've already answered, which is one thing that you're working on that is really exciting. That reconciliation book, the revision that you're doing sounds really exciting. I have another
I
question.
think
Go ahead.
there's another thing that
Okay. Yes, please share. Yeah.
I think it's very similar to that in that it's more public health, and so it's more like how do you shape a community,
Yeah.
or a state even. And it turns out the best way to do that, I think, is through what are called in the field of public health mediating organizations. So, a mediating organization is like a smaller organization that makes up and goes between
Yeah.
the impact on a whole society. So, examples are like a church, or a Christian university,
Right.
or a workplace, or a community group. And so we have been trying to run public campaigns in probably about 10 Christian colleges over the last 10 years. And then other types of organizations, including secular universities and churches. And the idea is, how do you interest people in forgiving, and how do you equip them to forgive in a public health way rather than a therapy way, which is one on one, or a couple therapy, one on two, or group therapy, even? This
Yeah.
is like, how do you provide these resources and direct people to the resources so that they can use them, and that has an impact on public health?
Wow.
So we just got accepted this week, a big article of almost 3,000 people in a secular university in Colombia,
Mm,
the country of Colombia. And what we looked at was 16 different activities
mhm.
that we provided to the community, and which ones of them had an impact on helping people forgive and which ones didn't. And did it help to do more than less? And so, I mean, the short story is, yes, the more you do, the better.
Mhm.
If you do three or less activities, it doesn't make much difference. There's just not enough energy and put into it. But after three, from four, five, six, seven, there's a linear progression of how much forgiveness takes place
Mm,
per activity that's used.
wow.
And then, which activities make the most impact? Well, you can think of impact as who chooses to do those activities.
Mhm.
Well, it turns out, in a busy college environment, going and praying under a forgiveness tree, or posting on a forgiveness wall that you've forgiven this person, those are very popular because they take
Really?
about
Wow.
7.2 minutes
Mm,
to do. They
mhm.
have no impact. They don't help people forgive,
Mm,
but
mm,
they're very popular. On the other hand, we offered 6-hour groups.
mm.
Well, those have a huge impact on the 50 people who chose to do them. But
Right.
nobody out of a university of 10,000 people, 50
Right.
people.
Yeah.
So it doesn't have any public health impact, although it
Mm,
has private impact on people who do the groups. So it turns out that activities that take from like an hour to 3 or so hours have the most impact, and they're short enough that people actually do them. And
wow.
so those tend to have a wider public health impact.
Wow. That's
Anyway,
real.
I'm
Yeah.
spending a lot of time thinking about public health these days, and reconciliation, more community-based things.
I'm so glad that you brought that up though, because I think that sweet spot of not having it be just putting a sticky note on a tree, but also, even though we see the value in like intensive therapy, how maybe in general people might not be inclined to utilize that. And so 1 to 3 hours, I'm thinking about like online interventions that might be possible, maybe like a brief workshop that might be more attractive than a 6 hour workshop. So
Yeah.
that's really fascinating. And congratulations on that publication.
Yeah, thanks.
Um, which journal is it? So my listeners
Uh,
can look it up. Yeah.
International Journal of Public Health.
Okay. We'll be sure to try to post that. International Journal of Public Health. Thank you.
And it's probably not even turned into a DOI at this,
Sure.
because
Yeah.
we just got it this week,
Got it.
like Tuesday,
Yeah.
that notified that it was accepted.
Makes sense. We'll keep an eye out for it.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're one of my few guests who has experience teaching at a secular university and a long career at a secular university, but also publicly Christian, both as a person, but as also as a scholar, which I find, again, so much to learn from because my network is primarily Christian scholars in Christian higher education. In your perspective, if you had advice for new faculty who is Christian and wanting to do the type of faith integration that you do so well, whether it's at a Christian higher ed or at a secular institution, what kind of advice might you have for them? If you had one advice or a couple of advices, what might that be?
Mhm. Well,
Mm,
I think a lot of it will come down to know yourself,
okay.
and know what you really want to do.
Yeah.
because in many ways, it's really difficult to be at a Christian university and do a lot of high impact research. It can be done. Daryl Van Tongeren at Hope
At
College
Hope. Yeah. Yeah.
is doing fantastic work with
Mm.
big grants and books. And so, but anyway,
Yeah.
it's really hard. And because the environment at a lot of Christian universities is so taken up with service,
Mm.
Christian service, and with teaching.
Yeah.
And those are valued. And research is like, yeah, you should do research. You really should.
But find your own time.
I'm not going to give
Yeah.
you any time to do this. And so, what you're competing against in a secular university like at VC, people come in and they teach maybe 1-on-1
Mm.
and have no service until they go up for tenure.
Yeah.
So basically, except program service. So you got program service, but you're not expected to do wider service. And so they have all this time to create a strong research program. I mean, it's not all fun and roses because you're told as you're hired, the dean will say, you understand, of course, that if you don't have at least one major grant by the time you go up for tenure, you won't be getting tenure.
Stressful.
So
Yeah.
that's not easy.
Mhm.
But on the other hand, over 80% of our faculty in psychology have grants.
Mm.
So you have this environment to
Yeah.
mentor you and coach you and take you on as a co-investigator on a project and show you how what the ropes are and how this is done.
Yeah.
You don't have that in most Christian universities. Now, they're always the odd folks that do that. So
Mm.
at Wheaton, I spent a year
Mm.
as a distinguished scholar at Wheaton, and Jamie Aiton has multiple grants at Wheaton, but of course, he's not a faculty member anymore. He's running the Disaster Institute and he's administering
Right.
a whole program, a master's program, but not having the day-to-day same pressures that a new professor, assistant professor is going to have. So know yourself.
Mm.
What do I want to do? And place yourself in the place where you can do what you want to do,
Right.
and then try to shape your environment as much as you can so that you are able to do what you want to do without neglecting the things you have to do. So that sounds so easy, especially if a person says, well, I really want to do research, but I don't really like to teach that much. I know you're going to have to teach. You're a
Mhm.
university professor. So it sounds easy. Know yourself.
Right. But that
I
echoes.
couldn't
Mhm.
do that. I'm like, I like to teach. Well, I want to teach. And so
Mhm.
I did a lot of teaching and I taught big classes. I taught lots of big classes and I research. I love research and I'm going to do research. And so I did research. But over the years, I found that I could shape a research team
Yeah.
that I didn't have to do all the research. I can be involved in this team that does the research
Yeah.
and still be able to teach as much as I wanted to do.
Mm. Yeah. Your advice echoes many of my guests' advice, which is to have a good self-awareness and see if you're a good fit in Christian higher education or maybe at a secular university, that not every Christian scholar belongs on a Christian higher ed campus, that it just might not be a good fit. And as an aside, I feel, again, very impressed that, Everett, you have experiences in Christian higher education as well, and that you can speak to sort of the challenges that we experience as if you've spent many years on our campus. So thank you for, that insight. My last question is, it's kind of a fun one, or it can be a serious one as well. But if you were to ask my next guest without knowing who they are, because I don't off the top of my head, what question might you ask? Like, what difficult or fun or in-depth question might you throw at them without you having to answer it. And if you're curious about what my last guest asked about, which you've addressed in many ways today, they asked, what is the most important thing about your vocation? What is the most important thing about your vocation? But for you, Everett, if you were to throw a question at my next guest, what might it be?
I would say the thing to ask them is, you are probably standing at a crossroads in your life.
Mm, mm,
And so there's what you want to do if you keep on this road. What do you want to do?
mm,
But there are also probably alternative ways that you could go. There are at least two alternative ways you could go on this
mm,
road.
mm,
Where would those take you? And what would you want to do if you went in each of those paths?
mm,
That's a complicated and thought-provoking question for most people. We're always standing on a crossroad and going, I have options.
mhm.
I don't have to continue on automatic pilot straight ahead. And even if I
Right.
do, what do I want to accomplish?
Mhm.
But what are the other options that I have?
That's great. I really appreciate that. And both big and small, there are crossroads that we encounter on a daily basis. Thank you. I personally found this conversation today so meaningful. And
It's
again,
fun.
so good to connect with someone whose work I've admired for such a long time. So thank you. Anything else you'd like to add before I stop the recording?
No, I think I'm fine. Thanks.
Okay.
And I appreciate being on, and it was fun. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to the Cross Cultural Psych podcast with Dr. Paul Youngbin Kim. We hope this content was meaningful. If you enjoyed the podcast, we invite you to write a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Also, let us know what you'd like to see covered in future episodes. We hope you'll join us next time.
I log into Zoom, and it's like, you have a previous version you need to update it. So I'm sitting here, and it's just going on, and it updated, and then it came on. There is a more recent update available, and then so it did it again,
Yeah.
and then it kicked me out of the room, and that's when I'm emailing you. No, I'm not in. No. So anyway, I'm in now.
I mean, Zoom seems to update at the most inconvenient time, right?